Chapter 2. The Ripple Effect. It's 5:30 a.m. David knows this because even without looking at his alarm plus clock, brought to him by Arrowgate Solutions, he always wakes up 10 minutes before the thing goes off. He uses these 10 minutes to stare aimlessly at the ceiling of his room, preparing himself for the events of another day. 10 minutes later, the buzzer goes off. He realizes he hasn't taken his morning Chembal. With a sigh, David pops the lid and takes 3. David makes his way to the bathroom to begin the ritual of getting ready for work. The sterile white of the bathroom shines bright as he enters, and before David can realize that he actually hates this bright, sterile white room, the pills he took 5 minutes ago kick in, and suddenly he has more pressing matters to get to, like work. David rips through his casual routine as if nothing was any different, and goes back to his bedroom and its bland, creamy color to select his wardrobe of the day. Today, David went with a slightly lighter shade of brown slacks and a simple gray collared shirt. He makes sure to put his belt perfectly lined up with the button of his slacks and puts on his smart shoes and is out the door in no time. Ah, of course. I knew I was forgetting something, David mumbles to himself as he walks outside to the car. He forgot to grab a new core for the mower, and his section of the grass is still slightly taller than the others around it. "Hey, Dave," says a sudden voice from his right. David looks over and sees a tall, lean man with a stubble that is forming into a beard. The new fashion trend is quickly approaching him. This man is Steve, the tenant in the apartment townhouse that is linked to David's. "It's David. How are you this morning, Steve?" David asks. Steve and his wife do not normally bother him with much more than the occasional wave or the annual block party invites, which he attends but wishes there was a way to avoid. "Sorry, David, I always do that, but it's nothing, just getting ready to take the son to school, you know. But I couldn't help but notice you hadn't gotten around to mowing your side of the yard. I was just checking in to make sure all was well and good with you," Steve says. Something deep in the back of David's head momentarily sparks. It almost feels like when something bites at the back of your neck, but before David can pinpoint what that feeling is, he breathes in, and as he releases, says, "Yeah, sorry about that, Steve. Work has been all abuzz with the recent terrorist attack, and I was crunched even more this Monday than I was expecting. It just slipped, but I'll get it knocked into proper shape. No worries." Steve laughs uncomfortably. "I hear you, David. They really got you guys out there working hard right now, I bet. Just whenever you can. Thanks." Steve turns and heads back to his side to collect his son, and as David is walking to his car, he realizes what made Steve suddenly seem off guard. David said, "I'll get it knocked into proper shape, no worries." While it's not a bad thing, he spoke so casual. He is a federal employee, and the level in which they are expected to conduct themselves is an important part of the job. One can say whatever they want, as far as David knows. But to be someone in the line of work, David is, and to not take the role as seriously as one can, in all manners, could be seen as indifference to your role. As David hops in his car and presses the button, the car comes alive, and David places his hand on the auto-drive sensor. "Good morning, Dave. I see you have the map route directed for the office this morning. Shall I begin our trip?" asks the car's AI. "Yes," replies David. "But please refer to me as David. I do not go by Dave." David feels that feeling in his head again, some sudden, almost emotional reaction, but almost as quickly as the feeling comes, it is gone, and he reverts to thinking of his interaction with Steve. "I have got to get better at that," David thinks to himself. More and more lately, he has lapsed to using casual sayings and slang terms he hasn't really used since he started college, back when he was fresh out of his service. He wasn't sure why it was becoming an issue. He was also worried about the feeling he felt when speaking to Steve in the car just now. What was that? It felt familiar, yet I can't quite get what it was, David thinks. As the car drives through traffic, it plays the same talk radio station it usually chooses to start the day off with. David looks out the side window. He notices first the apartment suites, all lined up similar to his. He also begins to ponder why it seems his mind has been trailing off, or why he can't quite focus on things like before. Sure, he never cared much about things like sports, the news, or even the dating apps. He wonders why all of a sudden it's a struggle to give these things attention. The apartment suites give way first to apartment buildings, a style of living built more for lower income levels than the one he barely squeaked into. This style of living was at one time in his childhood the more common method of apartment life. But the suites, like the one he lives in, become more commonplace and desired as it offers neighborhood style of setting as opposed to big buildings with hallways, like streets inside the stone and brick behemoths. Soon this turns to the city and its large buildings full of people starting their days or ending them if they work night shifts for these private-owned corporations. Federal employees almost never have to worry about a night shift, since only a couple departments require it. Soon the car arrives at David's office and he shuts it off and heads toward the shelter, made for what few smokers remain. For a brief instant, as David begins to light his first cigarette, he thinks of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, though he isn't sure why. He shudders, as he worries that these types of thoughts he had been having for the last several weeks could mean he will need to up his dose. He is currently only on 4th-generation Chembal, and while it's not considered as potent as 5th or 6th, upgrading won't change the dosage amount. He knows, he has seen the advertisements warning it will only help stop the need for a future increases in dose amount. But if he is already in line for a prescription change to 4 per dose, that's how many he will have to take with the upgrade anyways. The insurance coverage he gets from his employee would not cover the complete cost of the more premium 5th and 6th gen, and quite frankly, he doesn't want to spend the extra cash on the new meds. As David wraps up his first and begins to light up his second cigarette out of the corner of his eye, he sees a different car park in the lot. At first, he thinks nothing of it, but seeing as there isn't much in the way of anything else happening here at the little smoke shack, he turns his head to take a more interesting view. The car is about the same model as the one he drives. Most in the lot are, but this one stands out due to the color. It's the only bright yellow car in the lot. Most federal employees take to driving white or black vehicles. David picked white simply because it was cheaper. In truth, they can pick any color. But if you want to be taken seriously, you play to the workplace politics, and no one plays it quite like those climbing the federal government ladders. This car screams someone from the private sector, and that has David's interest. The car starts to shut down, and as it does, the driver door opens. David, for what may be the first time since even he can remember, finds himself locked in place and unblinking. It's a woman. She looks to be near David's age. He can't be sure, but she couldn't be more than 30. Her hair was brown but looked like at some point before this job, she applied highlights, as there was blonde at the end of it. She had it in those wavy curls that seemed to bounce when she moved. She had a face that was a blend of soft features and what David thought to be perfect angles. She wore a dress that was business casual, but also showed that she was still aware of her youth, and her skin seemed to be in perfect condition. Not too dark as to look like she had turned it into leather in the sun, something David realized too late in life, but also giving the impression that she knew what the outdoors was like, aside from walking to her car to come to work. She walked somewhat quickly, and he realized she had an element of excitement on her face. This helped snap him out of the almost trance-like feeling he was in. Why would she be so excited to be walking towards the building? David pondered, before realizing that's the face all people who arrive on the first day look like. "Good morning to you, David," bellows an all-too-chummy voice, and David knows that he will have to turn around and face the horrors of Matthew and Simon's friendship. "How are you this morning, Matthew?" David asks, following the roadmap of the usual conversation. "It is a solid morning. Daisy was in top condition. She came and showed us she had improved her grade scores by a 2% margin." David knows that this really can mean nothing, as the school didn't grade off a 0 to 100 score scale any longer, instead opting to grade a performance marker compared to the child's prior markers. For all said, Daisy could be a complete stump, as David assumes she is, and she only became a slightly less complete stump. "That's excellent news, Matthew. Congratulations to Daisy, as well as you and Mary for all your hard work," David says. "Hey David, you catch last night's episode of Eager Bites?" questions Simon. Always with questions about something David never really cared about. Eager Bites was the current hot show on the airwaves, a show about people who go around to restaurants around the world trying any and all the exotic foods there are to try. Oftentimes, the show's core cast is made up of overweight or on the verge of becoming overweight media influencers ranging from actors, news anchors, singers, and the occasional good old-fashioned influencer who came into popularity through some viral video means. "No, I had to cut the lawn after work," Threw the whole afternoon off the rails in a sense. David lies. Shame. Rucka went to Louisiana and had a unique Cajun dish that made his face go bright red, and Liara Vickers went to a small cafe in Paris with cupcakes and muffins that are considered the top of the line, Simon declared. Although Rucka's face looked to turn into a cherry, he gave it a must-have rating. But Liara only rated the cupcakes as if passing by. It was insane. Simon's eyes widens as he talks about the show, and David copies the wide-eyed look as best he can to avoid disappointing Simon. As he stood there listening and occasionally speaking with Matthew and Simon about various topics that always seemed to be déjà vu of previous days, David's mind stayed with the girl in the yellow car, with the bouncing, wavy brown hair and just the slightest blonde highlights. In fact, he was so caught up in the memory of her walking towards the building, he lost track of both time and how many cigarettes he had smoked. Halfway through his fifth, Matthew looked at his MS watch +9 and declared, "Whoa, boys, if we stay out here too much longer, we will be late to our desks, and David will run afoul with his health." It was meant as a joke, and David knew it. The level of nicotine in these Kleenex cigarettes were nearly non-existent, but for some reason he felt something in the back of his mind, just a momentary thought, but as quickly as it popped up, it was gone. Slightly perplexed, David, Matthew, and Simon began to walk towards the door to start the day. As David made his way to his cube through the maze of gray walls and cheap blue carpet, he turned his head back and forth, looking into each cube, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman he saw in the parking lot. As he approached his own desk, and the wave of coffee and butterless popcorn became more and more evident, he sighed, realizing that the likelihood she would be not only on this floor, but in his section was so small that he shouldn't be searching so hard. As he turned the final corner to the spot where his cube was located, David looked up from the floor and nearly had a repeat of his reaction at the smoking hut. In the kitchenette, pouring herself a cup of coffee, was the brown-haired girl in the business-casual, yet youthfully stylish dress. He stopped for a moment, not aware of his staring, when she looked up at him and smiled. Something so small caused an immediate wave of feelings wash over David's brain that he hadn't experienced before. Actually, he wasn't even sure if he ever had. The overwhelming emotions all at once of joy, fear, excitement, hope, maybe even lust. He wasn't sure. He knew that these were emotions that he had felt in the past, as all people do. But this was raw. He was struck by the sudden wave of nausea caused by such an intense reaction. How strange the sensory overload was too much, and before he could think of anything else, he quickly moved into his cube, where he nearly fell into his plush 4U office chair and sat silently. His eyes bounced back and forth as he tried to piece together what he just experienced. In truth, working for the Medical Distribution Monitoring Quarter, or MDMQ, David knew certain things about the medications people around the world take. He knows, to an extent, the medications are to help focus people and retain a correct chemical balance in one's brain. But this wave of feelings he just felt was the most unbalanced thing he had ever felt, and it left him in utter shock. After a moment of thought and a quick sip of his hydrate juice, brought to him by Synth Drinks in partnership with Synth Eats, he slowly scooted his chair towards the opening of his cube. He was going to peek over at the kitchenette and see if she was still there. If so, he would have to approach her. He wasn't sure what he would say, why he would say it, or even why he thought he had to approach her. But he had to. HR violation be damned. He was going to just have a hopefully causal conversation with a fellow coworker, or at the very least someone who was in the office for the first time, and that he was curious as to why they were there. Never mind, she was a woman. That isn't supposed to matter. Not if it's kept professional. Which he knew would be the trick of it all. Then he began to slowly, with eyes as wide as Simon's, as he talked about that insufferable food show, peeked around the edge of the cube. However, this approach was abruptly cut short when she walked right in front of the opening and stopped facing David's desk. The shock of her suddenly appearing at the opening of his cube forced David to wildly lurch back. Granted, if he was in this position and anyone suddenly appeared, he would probably react the same, but in this case, it was her. He began a fast and quick fall backwards on the rolling wheels of the chair and let out a whelp that he thought was not tough or manly sounding as he fell. The back of his head collided perfectly with the edge of the desk and then to the floor. He opened his eyes to see her staring at him in utter shock. "Oh goodness, are you okay?" the woman asked, and David realized this was not the first impression he was going for. "Yes, of course. I think I rolled on a pen, or something is all." David lied, hoping that there was a pen or pencil under his desk to help with his little white lie. "Well, would you like a hand up?" the woman asked him. David, realizing he was still on the ground, popped up quickly, and before he realized she offered to help, he was already up to his feet. I do a lot of conditioning exercising, so I have a lot of spring in my step," David said, face reddening. Why in the world was that the first thing that came out of his mouth? And why was this conversation becoming one in which he was coming off as a moron? He was usually so in control of himself. Even though lately he was having more impulsive thoughts, he did a good job of keeping them to himself. She just smiled warmly back at him. Her eyes were a green hazel, and David, who never thought much about colors, decided that it was his favorite color. "My name's Ashley Ivy. Today is my first day with the Medical Distribution Monitoring Quarter, so I'm trying to get to know as many of my new coworkers as possible." Ashley, he had a name now, and he was feeling almost dizzy from all this interaction. He then, of course, realized he did just bang the back of his head on the desk in his cube, and that might be the reason behind the dizzy feeling. Well, Ashley, Miss Ivy. My name is David Nash. It's a pleasure to meet you and be one of the first to welcome you to our team here," David said, somewhat automatically. He knew it was the proper thing to say when a new arrival to the team introduced themselves, but he found it lacking something for some reason and added further, "Where were you before you joined us here?" She gave him an all-too-welcoming smile, one that is either well-practiced or is just an incredibly gifted natural smile. "I come from the private sector, actually. I spent 3 years in the advertising sector of Synthetes. I got that job right out of college. But when I saw the medical distribution monitoring quarter sections opening for an advertisement specialist, something told me I needed to get on with the Fed. The benefits are just too good," she said, with a slight giddiness in her voice that made David himself take a few moments to think about how great the benefits provided to people here were. Until he realized that as good as they were also sometimes lacking in certain areas. Again, without thinking, David spoke. "Well, yeah, I bet it may seem better than a lot of the private sector, but we don't get the newest generation of Chembal at discount, only 3rd and 4th gen, and only half your yearly doctor visits are covered. The other half, you need to budget for." As soon as the words came out of his mouth, he saw her expression change to one of shock, and David realized he made a serious error in speaking so offhandedly. He began to try and do some immediate damage control. "Not that that's really bad or anything," David began. I bet everywhere else sucks a ton of loads compared to what we get." "What the hell? What did he just say? He's on the clock and he just said, sucks a ton of loads compared to what we get? Well, that's going to be it. He may have just flushed all his time here at the MDMQ down the toilet. He spoke that way, and not only that, but he did so in the office, in front of a new employee." Ashley's look of shock suddenly turned to a different kind of smile. A smile that indicates something almost mischievous. "David, you should have been a comic." Her smile and her simple response somehow made David feel a little better about the situation, but he knew that compared to most of what passed as comedy in the media today, he would still be in hot water. "I didn't mean to say that I don't Ashley cut him off mid-sentence. "It's no sweat, David. I believe an appropriate saying would be the spice of life keeps us alive. Am I right?" David simply shook his head in agreement, too worried he would further put himself in a bad light. "As far as I'm concerned, we just had a very nice and cordial introduction. Maybe I'll see you at the lunch hour or something." She said it with a calm and collected voice that made David realize something was very different about Ashley. After she left him at his cube, with a backwards glance and smile, David fell back into his seat. After he picked it up off the floor, of course. He sat staring blankly at his screen. He couldn't understand how Ashley seemed in control and balanced out. Yet, she freely shifted between being unprofessional and professional. It was as if she was able to be like everyone else, but at the drop of a dime flip over to someone who almost sounded unbalanced. Of course, if she was unbalanced, chemically speaking, there was no way she would have landed a job here at the MDMQ. So what was all that? Is that how Simon and his online girlfriend spoke to one another? Is that how Matthew and his wife Mary spoke? David always figured part of his issue was that he was never much of a flirt. Sure, he had been with a woman or two in his life, mostly during his military days. But he was always caught up in his work or school to give it much more than a fleeting thought. With his father having been shipped off when he was so young to be reassigned, he didn't have anyone to tell him to flirt with women. His mother was around while he was growing up, this was true, but the same time his father was sent to be reassigned, his mother was sent off for a 2-week period of re-education. And when she came back, she seemed distant and cold to him. She was more robotic than people who overdosed on Chembal. Overdosing on Chembal was something that happened a lot with the first and second gen of the medication. People would start getting dosage prescriptions in the 4 to 5 pills in one dose, and after taking so many at once over time, they became a glazed-over mess. They still moved around, did their jobs and tasks, but they lacked something behind their eyes. That's the look his mother had when she came back. The only thing she seemed to ever show real emotion over was when David was 16, and his doctor advised his mother that he was upping David's prescription to 3, and that at the rate David's chemical imbalance was going, he may have to take up to 5 by the time he was 30. She cried a lot that week and forced David to be as automatic as the time on the clock. He did a good job keeping his prescription at 3 after that, but even now, he could feel it. Much like he has for a while now, something in the back of his head was clawing at him, and he was worried about what that could mean for him. David spent the first half of his day thinking a lot about these types of things. As he robotically went through his work, he thought of the very limited memories of his father, his glazed-over mother, but mostly he thought of Ashley and everything about their first conversation. By the time the noon buzzer went off to let people who needed to pop Chembal to do so, which was everybody, David reached for his pill bottle like everyone else. Then he shook the bottle to the universal rattling of the office and the world, and watched as the first pill fell into his palm. Then he watched as the second pill fell into his palm. Then he stopped shaking his bottle and thought for a moment. Then that sharp sensation at the back of his brain took over, and instead of being just a sensation, it became a thought. And just like that, instead of taking his prescribed 3 pills, David slipped the lid back over his bottle quickly, and without any further consideration took only the 2 pills.